Hey everybody, this is Huston from Contender Bicycles, and today we're going to be talking about your creaky bike. We're going to run through a couple key areas on the bike where creaks commonly come from, as well as illustrate a sort of process of elimination that we use here at the shop to help source where a creak might be coming from. So stay tuned. Hopefully this video will help you source where that frustrating creak is coming from on your own bike. So I'm going to preface this video by saying that it's impossible for me to cover in one video all of the different areas where a creak might be coming from. There's a million different reasons why your bike might be creaking. We see new ones all the time here at the shop. And I'm also going to talk about how it's not always immediately obvious where the creak is coming from. Especially on carbon frame bikes, a creak can echo through the frame and it can cause you to believe that the creak is coming from somewhere else rather than where it's actually coming from. That's why everybody always thinks that the creak is coming from the bottom bracket, when in reality, it's almost always a different issue. A good place to start when you're trying to diagnose creaks would be to begin with easily accessible areas on the bike that could be rattling. A good place to check is bottle cage bolts. Sometimes those come loose and can cause quite a racket when you're going down the trail. So tighten those up. Another good place to check is the nut on your valve stem here. I've gotten a rattle from one of those before, so just make sure that those are tight. This specific bike has headset cable routing, but oftentimes if you have longer cables, those can slap together and cause a rattle, but you can mitigate that by putting some foam on there or a zip tie or some sort of clip to hold those together. That's a good place to start. Next, you want to check all of your bolts on your bike and just make sure that everything is tight and hasn't come loose. A good place to start is your through axles, front and rear. Check your bar and stem, make sure that there's no play in your headset. Check your pedals, make sure that those haven't come loose, as well as your cranks. And then after that, you can check linkage bolts. It's pretty common to get play from any of those areas. One of the most common areas on your bike where creaks can come from is your drivetrain. When inspecting your drivetrain, make sure that it's free of excess dirt and grime. Check your cassette, your chain rings, your chain, and the pulley wheels on your derailleur. That's a really common place where creaks can come from. You can use a pick to scrape any excess dirt and grime off of there. And while you're inspecting your drivetrain, if you have the tool handy, this is a good time to check chain stretch. That's a lot of times what can contribute to a really noisy drivetrain is having a chain that is past its lifespan. We use one of these tools to check how far your chain has stretched. You just slot it in here, and if the end of here falls into this inner link, then that means that your chain would have stretched 0.5 millimeter. We recommend replacing your chain at the 0.75 millimeter mark. That's gonna prolong the life of your drivetrain, because if you run a chain that's really stretched out, it starts to wear your cassette, derailleur, and chainring much more quickly. One somewhat less than obvious area where we very commonly see creaks come from is your saddle, specifically the rails and this clamp here, and your seat post collar. All of your weight is on the saddle. Oftentimes it can shift just slightly whenever you're pedaling. This is a really good place to check to see where a creak might be coming from. You can check, make sure that your bolt is tight. If you have a carbon fiber frame, make sure that you use a little bit of carbon paste when installing your seat post. And if you have a carbon fiber rail saddle, the rails of your saddle are a really good place to put just a little bit of fiber grip to keep that saddle from shifting. On full suspension mountain bikes, it's also very common for creaks to be coming from any number of your linkage bolts on your bike. A good way to check to see if a creak is coming from a linkage bolt is to press down on your top tube to cycle your suspension. That way it eliminates if a creak is coming from your saddle. If you push on the saddle, it could be creaking from the saddle, but if you press on your top tube, that's a good way to isolate and make sure that it's just the linkage that's getting stressed in that moment. Another thing that you can do is, if you want to be even more thorough, you can remove your rear shock and then cycle your suspension. If it creaks without the shock in there, it's definitely coming from the linkage. And if you're moving your suspension and it just feels rough, then it might be time for a linkage service. You're gonna wanna pay special attention to your pedals and cranks. It's very common for creaks to be coming from both of those areas. Make sure that your pedals are nice and tight, as well as check to make sure that there's no play side to side. It's really common for us to see a creak or play coming from the pedal spindle itself as those bearings wear out. In addition, if you're able and you have the correct tools, you can remove your cranks and make sure that the crank spindle has plenty of grease applied to it. The next step, after you've checked all of your bolts, made sure that everything is tight, inspected your drivetrain, your pedals and cranks and whatnot, is to go ride the bike and see if the creak is still repeating. You're gonna want to pedal the bike seated and standing to make sure that it's not coming from your seat post like I had previously mentioned. That's also a good time to really push on the cranks and try to flex the frame and see if that it's coming from the frame itself. Make sure that you use your best judgment in determining if you have the correct tools and knowledge to remove and reinstall parts from your bike. If a part is removed and then reinstalled improperly, it can not only damage your bike, but it won't fix your creaking problem. At the end of the day, if you have a really pesky creak that just won't go away, bring it to us at Contender Bicycles and we'll be happy to diagnose and fix that problem for you. Finding creaks and fixing them is kind of like a moving target. It's almost never the same thing twice. We've seen a million different reasons why a bike might be creaking here at the shop, but hopefully this video helps you pinpoint where the creak might be coming from, as well as illustrate a couple easy fixes, which hopefully will get you on your creak fixing way, because a quiet bike is a happy bike.